want to thank Rabbi Teller for a beautiful Shabbos. After his word, his remarks, um, he will be selling his wonderful svarim. He wrote, I think, 29. There aren't 29 there, so if you want some of the books that aren't there, please be in touch with him. He'll figure out a way to get it to you. I want to share a reflection with you for one moment. I had my ninth grade Rebbe was a man named Rabbi Moshe Kesiru. He was a survivor, and we didn't. I was an American kid. I was a Mets fan, so it's long stuff. For me, that was suffering. When I entered his classroom in ninth grade, I didn't understand who he was. I didn't appreciate it, but he shared with us stories. Like when he went to the reunion of the Holocaust survivors, I think it was 1980, if I'm not mistaken. He went there and he shared with us stories of like people meeting each other, hadn't seen each other before WhatsApp, BCE, before the cell phone era. So it's like, this is like people met each other after 40 years or 35 years of not seeing each other. It was unbelievably powerful. And I didn't understand a man whose life was destroyed, and yet somehow he was such a kind and wonderful and giving person. And it was a whole world of people that now when I look back in my life, see what an incredible impact they had. In fact, that was my whole shul. I went to the end of Pure Hills. My whole shul was a shul of people who were in their 50s and 60s that their whole lives were destroyed and they rebuilt their lives. And that's a phenomenon that does not exist today. We're at the very end of it. And that's why a lot of the focus of the Shabbos was really the light in the darkness. Rabbi Teller Dafka asked to speak about the personal message of the Holocaust, and I couldn't think of a better person to introduce him than Rabbi Cooper, who I mentioned earlier today is a mentor of mine. Cooper is a big light in our community. He does so much work for Klal Yisrael in creative and brilliant ways. I'm not going to give you his CV because that would take up the time we have allotted, but I just will say, among the interesting things that Rabbi Cooper is doing now is he's the chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He's an author, associate dean of the Simon Wiesel Center, person with a lot of opinions and weighty and important opinions that have helped Klal Yisrael and to bring about tremendous shalom in ways that we hope will continue to be fruitful. Hashem should give him and Zeichas Chayil Arichas Yom V'Shalom. Let him ask him.
Thank you, Kvarav, and a beautiful gathering today to be together. Rabbi Teller and so many of you at the luncheon, and he didn't disappoint. Now, I was going to go right to my introduction, but since Rabbi Brander mentioned the New York Mets. And suffering. So he sort of teed up a story I told him earlier today. A few months ago, we were about ready to leave Eretz Israel after the wedding of our grandson to Rabbi Teller's granddaughter. Yeah, I mean, we can speak all night about the shidduchim, but I'm not going to go there. It's a sensitive topic. So far, so good. But I got a call from the Vatican because it was the 60th anniversary of the Nostra Aetate. That is a very important document, which was caused by the Shoah and the embarrassment to the Catholic Church, and started by Pope John the 23rd, Pope John Paul II, and eventually now, it was 60 years, we had new Pope, Pope Leo the 14th, later. So they asked me to come, along with many other rabbis from around the world. He gave an excellent speech, really terrific. It was on a Wednesday at about 11 o'clock. Had a small turnout in St. Peter's Square of 100,000 people. Incredible. So, but I had come a long way. Roz had to go home on her own to LA. So I told the handlers, I said, look, I came a very long way. I want my 2 minutes with the Pope. It's usually we have private things, but I have something to give him. And when he came around to give a Shalom Aleichem to everyone, the appropriate people did a blocking back, and I had my 2 minutes. So I gave the Pope, an illuminated Tehillim from Yerushalayim, which I inscribed. When I gave him the Psalms, as we call it in the old country, I said to him, you know, Christians and Jews alike, we look to the words of King David when we're in pain, when we have no hope. And I know you know about these kinds of things because you're a Chicago White Sox fan. But I also know about pain and suffering. I'm a New York Mets fan. So the only picture of the two of us so far is two guys, two baseball fans laughing at each other. My introduction to Rabbi Chanoch, I don't know what exactly he's going to say tonight, but when you read his Svarim, when you've heard him before, some of you were in his classes, many of you had your daughters and granddaughters in class. He's a master storyteller. But I want to explain to you what the unique quality is and what he and very few other people have done. And I learned this message 50 feet from Martin Luther King's graveside in Atlanta. It was a couple of years ago. I was there to open our Holocaust exhibit in the area, not far, very prominent location. And because it wasn't just another venue, I came, unlike what I usually do, very early. And I noticed that there was an African-American gentleman who came early. It was just the two of us. And he was dressed impeccably. He looked sharp, he was sharp, and he came over and he said, you must be Rabbi Cooper, right? I gave his name. I'm State Senator so-and-so. If you have a few minutes, I want to explain to you why I came. So I was born in Manhattan, in Harlem, the middle child of six children, born to 5 fathers. My mother worked very hard, and so did I, and I bootstrapped myself. I got into Columbia University, then I went on to law, and then after law school, I came down to Atlanta, and as you can see, I've done pretty well for myself. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I want to explain to you what my life is actually like, because I've spent the last 5 decades trying to discover my roots. I've spent a lot of time, I've spent a lot of money, and I finally was able to trace my personal roots to a plantation in Virginia, year 1852. That's as far back as I can trace, he didn't use the term, my ethos, my footprint. And he said, as a result, despite everything that I've achieved in my life, and I'm proud of it, I don't know where I came from. I don't know what my forefathers stood for. What were their values? What were they trying to impart to their children? Total cutoff. I will never find out the full extent of my roots. And why I came here today is because I wanted you to think about it, because for you to understand how lucky you are. Because, and he was very well versed in the Shoah. He did his home, this man who was very bright. So I know about Eichmann, I know about the final solution, I know what the Nazis said after World War II when they thought they had won at least the war against the Jews. But they didn't win the war because somehow those who survived the Shoah managed to become the bridge between the past that the Nazis wanted to totally eliminate, to obliterate, all of the teachers, everything about what Judaism stood for. They failed. And I'm here to tell you that they failed because you have survivors of the Holocaust. They are the bridge to your future. And it is truly a gift, a miracle that you and your generation and your children and grandchildren have that gift, that the bridge was never in the end broken. I don't know about something Mishulash or anything else. He was talking as an American, as a black man, and he was trying to explain what it means to have a black hole in your personal history, in your roots. You don't know at the end of the day where you came from, what your forefathers and mothers stood for, what they were ready to live and die for. And to me, that night, at that event, I was watching him the whole time because I think he gave, certainly for me, an important piece of mussar and elevated even more the respect that we have. I also grew up in Brooklyn. Many of my teachers were survivors of the Shoah. It didn't mean very much to me when I was younger. As I learned more and more growing up and looking back at some of the teachers and their suffering, we're talking about back then, when I started going to school in 1956, 57. You're talking about the types of horrible nightmares and memories that you have to think back and say, how did these people manage to get up in the morning, let alone function, let alone whether it's Australia and Melbourne or in Toronto or in Eretz Israel or here in the United States, how these survivors came and uplifted. They weren't invited to do that, but they did it anyway, to uplift Jewish life in a profound way and to be able to relate to people like our incredibly talented and dedicated speaker tonight, the Torah Shabbat Peh, I'm in a few weeks going to Lublin, first time, Lublin, Poland. And there's a university, and believe it or not, they have a program named in honor of Rabbi Heschel at the university. And I was invited to come speak. I wasn't sure I wanted to go. It's not my favorite place in the world. But when I heard that their offices are located in the office of Lubachnik, the mass murderer of that part of the world during the Shoah, and the gentleman who's in charge of this project, who works for the Vatican, I met him in Rome, when he told me where they selected to put their offices to reintroduce Jewish values to generations of Poles who are clueless, I decided that I would accept the go. So tonight, you're going to hear from a very talented bridge builder, bridge maker, but also, if he had to lie down to connect the different generations, I think over the years, he schlepped around all over the world to basically connect younger generations who had no clue to the vast treasure of Yiddishkeit, the Jewish values and heroism that otherwise would have been lost. Unfortunately, my African-American friend doesn't have a partner in his own community to be able to bridge that gap. How lucky we are that we have Rabbi Teller tonight to give us a little bit more insight in the Torah Shabbat Peh of generations that were lost. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As always, Rabbi Cooper is an impossible act to follow, and I'm humbled. But the only thing which is true is I always say this, I love to follow Rabbi Cooper. So all my life, if I could do this, I would be very, very pleased. So thank you. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you very much, gracious host and hostess. I was determined, if you saw me speak over Shabbat, almost the entire time I had notes. A lot of the talks I gave was fresh meat. I never spoke before about these subjects. And I was determined tonight not to take notes. I wanted to speak from my heart. At the end, I chickened out and I wrote some notes. I was thinking of commenting. I don't know in the best taste, but knowing the background, where we're coming from, in 1981 was the sixth Knesset Gadol, the sixth convocation of great rabbis. Somewhat dubious it will be a seventh one, but Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky was the star attraction. He was at the time in his young 90s. And on the flight going back to America, he was ensconced between two grandchildren. And these grandsons were like fighting over every movement that he made, how they could help him. Sitting across was Yisrael Kesar, the head of the Histadrut. And he had his son with him. His son was very much engaged in the creature comforts of the flight. At one point, this fellow turns to Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky and he said to him, how is it that your grandchildren, they just, every second, all they want to do is assist you, and I can't even get my son's attention? Which Rabbi Kamenetsky responded, we believe in Torah Min Hashamayim. We believe that we have a tradition that goes all the way back to Sinai. You believe in evolution. So my children look at me as one generation closer to the giving of the Torah, and your children look at you as one generation closer to the eighth. So this explains everything. Okay, from the heart. When I grew up, this is really indicated, I can raise my voice. Yes? Tell them honestly and truly. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
It'll look louder if I hold this. I don't want to hold it. That's the problem. But if you tell me, I'll go back to the mic. Mike, please. When I grew up,
Bye.
Mike. I offered it. Okay. When I grew up, I'm already 43. When I grew up, why is that funny? I try to convince people that it's my age. They believe I'm 42, but it's really it's 43. When I grew up, we saw a lot of numbers. Numbers engaged in the flesh, engraved in the flesh. I wonder how many my children have seen, if my grandchildren have seen any at all. And in this regard, I wish to relate to you three stories. One is, in my neighborhood in Jerusalem, which is a pretty devout neighborhood, Erev Yom Kippur, the eve of Yom Kippur is the most crowded day in the men mikvah, SRO, squeeze room only. And it's all Hasidim and Yerushalmim, very devout people. It's very boisterous. Everybody wishing Katyatov Katyar. And there's one kid from across the street in the Or Sameach Yeshiva for beginners. How do I know it's from Or Sameach? Said on his t-shirt, Or Sameach Wrestling. I just don't know. He had a earring and a ponytail. Clearly he was not a Chassid, nor a Jerusalemite. And he felt legitimately very much out of place. And again, the mikvah was very boisterous and crowded. We wishing Katyatov Katyar. And I cannot tell you the story delicately because in a mikvah there's no way to conceal because everything, I'm sorry for the repetition. There's no way to conceal because everything is revealed. And he placed his palms over his biceps, very apparent to me and to others. He had a tattoo that was not appropriate for Erev Yom Kippur. I dare say not appropriate for Ganser Freilach, but certainly not the eve of Yom Kippur. And the people in this mikvah were not especially subtle, about as subtle as heavy metal is subtle. And they're gawking and gaping. This poor kid was highly embarrassed, about to step into the pool, and he slips and trips. And there's this roaring silence in the mikvah, sphinx-like silence as these lewd and gaudy tattoos were flying through the air. I cannot describe, I shan't describe to you, but these were not anchors, the most inappropriate thing you could ever imagine. And the kid died 1,000 deaths. Before it was so boisterous, and now the mikvah went totally silent. You could hear an ant's heartbeat. It's as if we went deaf. No one was moving. The kid turned alabaster, and I saw him cogitating he'll jump into the pool, and he will never come out. At that moment, this story happened 32 years ago. An elderly neighbor of mine walked across the moist marble floor. It's 32 years later, and I can still hear in my ears the thwack, thwack, thwack. as he walked across the moist marble floor and went over to this kid who's more dead than alive and said to his heavily, Yiddishy, European accent in English, don't toy him, come on. I also have a tattoo, pointed numbers going up his flesh, and I went to my Gehenna, and you went to your Gehenna. Let's begin Yom Kippur together. Spontaneously everyone over wished him a good year and a Shana Tova. So how one small thing can make all the difference in the world. The second story is I have a friend who has a friend, Joseph Telushkin, is our mutual friend. And he has a friend. And he's a psychiatrist in New York City. He wrote a book about depression entitled Hello Darkness, My Old Friend. This fellow, his name is Ike. His uncle was a physician in the Catskill Mountains. And his wife was his receptionist. One day, this fellow Ike, lived in Washington Heights, a very well-known Jewish neighborhood. And one day, the aunt calls up and says, Ike, on Sunday, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is coming to the clinic. Would you like to meet him? What kid who grew up in Washington Heights in the 1950s wouldn't give his right arm to meet Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, the greatest halachic authority of America, the world? So Sunday morning, he scrubs his face and puts on his Yom Tov finery. He's sitting in the office looking as religious as he possibly can. Hajja, 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 hajja. And the office gets more full. The clinic is filling up. And finally, Rav Moshe's out in Argenter. And his aunt walks over, and she goes over to Rabbi Feinstein and says, Rabbi Feinstein, I'm very sorry, but there's a lot of people here. You're going to have to wait your turn. And then plants a kiss on both of his cheeks. And Ike melts into the floorboards. When he can finally emerge, he crawls over, and his halt in Yiddish, he said, Entschuldig, Moshe, my daughter. Sie weiß nicht, sie ist nicht, she doesn't know, my aunt, she doesn't know any better. And Rav Moshe said, shh, she's got the numbers. She's holier than I. And lastly, they asked the Satmar Rebbe, what's going to be? Lacher Meir asked you, when you're no longer here, who's going to give us a blessing? He said, go to shul. You see men putting on their tefillin, you see the numbers on the wrist. That's their affidavit to Shemayim. These are people you can ask a blessing from. The best known story of the Holocaust. What is the best known story of the Holocaust? It's not a hard question. Correct, Anne Frank. Anne's story is not a reflective story because she wasn't in the ghettos, wasn't in the camps, she had a roof over her head, a modicum of food. But because it's a story, it's easier to relate. I'm a senior docent in Yad Vashem. And I guess what's unique about my tour is that at any time there are dozens of tours going on, At any time there are dozens of tours, and they're unspooling so much data that the head cannot absorb. As kids like to say, TLI. And so what I do is, I tell individual stories. And from that I pull out the information, makes it more memorable and personable. And whatever information I'm trying to convey, I'm trying to do it in that way, that it's a personal way, because where we're holding now, if we don't make the story personable, it's reminiscent of the story of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem, it was said, was able to go to a particular spot in the forest, recite a specific formula, and an angel appeared. One generation later, they didn't know where that spot in the forest was. But they recited the formula and no angel appeared. And one generation later, they didn't know the formula, nor did they know the spot in the forest. And there's no angel. And we, so many generations later, would we have the grandeur of the Baal Shem Tov? And the answer is we have everything. For we have the story, and that brings us back. And that's why I like to tell the story, so we should be able to recount what these people did and the legacy which they gave us. And the hard question which I ask in the beginning of my Torah always is, how do we commemorate those who have perished? I'm usually told schoolyards and playgrounds, which I'm fine with. But I also like the idea of having children. Children perform mitzvot. The Gemara tells the story that Chizkiyahu HaMelech, and no one was more responsible for learning than he. Midan v'ad Beersheba, from the north all the way to the south, even the little children with the intricate, difficult mishnayos of Taharos. And what did they do when he died? They didn't make a memorial or literature or statues. Because memorials can become mausoleums. And literature can become ephemeral gibberish. And statues can become shards of pottery. What did they do? Hoshiva Yeshiva al Kivro. They established a yeshiva on his burial spot. That's fitting tribute. I'm sure you all know about the Aztecs and the Incas. Very few heads are nodding. You know, like I told you, I'm a docent in Yad Vashem. And I feel like I have to teach history from the beginning because you can't understand World War II unless you know World War I. We had a very interesting revelation today. I don't know if that was at lunch or not. It was last night. You see, I'm a teacher. And when I teach, I always say humorous things to keep my students awake. But I always tell myself something more entertaining to entertain myself. And last night it was so good I felt I had to share it with them. It occurred to me last night that if they would have called it World War I at the time, it would have been so depressing. Hence it was called the Great War. So I have to teach people about World War I to get us onto World War II, some kind of historical basis. And the Aztecs and the Incas, it's a dead story. They are no more. We don't want that to be our story, a plaque on the wall. They heard the Aztecs or Incas. I don't want to sound too sharp, but as we say in Tillim, we say in Rosh Chodesh and Hallel, Lo hamesim yaharuka. Again, I don't want to sound too sharp, but without life, death has no future. We have to perpetuate the stories. I try and explain what ghetto life was to people who just have no concept. It's an oxymoron, ghetto life. You know what an oxymoron is. Like family vacation. My favorite oxymoron. Army intelligence. Just almost bagels. All right, you got that. Life in the ghetto was not life as we know it. I'm just going to change my subject now because it's just too, there's no reason to go through the life of the ghetto with you tonight. I can be very graphic and there's no need for it. I mean, there is a need at one point that you should be aware of it. I wanted to say, in 1938, Rabbi, you didn't tell me how long to speak. And we've been doing this all Shabbat long.
2 hours, yeah.
2 or 3 hours, okay. I was going to go for 4 hours, but we're going to make this a sprint and not a marathon. In 1938, it's a watershed year in the destruction of Jewry. 3 key events. Beginning in March was the Anschluss, where Hitler believed that 2 countries would speak the same languages, have the same flag. He marched into Austria. Now, when this happened, and overnight, Austrian Jewry was subjected to even worse situation than German Jews were. It was like a pressure curve which had been building up. The American cabinet was concerned about the plight of one Austrian Jew. Who was? Rabbi Cooper, don't answer.
Sigmund Freud.
Pardon me? That is correct. Sigmund Freud. Dr. Freud. But that's the way it works. It's easier to think about one than 180,000. It's easier to think about Anne Frank than 6 million. It's easier to think about paper clips and paper clips than 6 million souls. That's the way the mind worked. And the President of the United States, named after the highway in Manhattan, was really unconcerned. You know, people think he was an anti-Semite. I'm not sure if that's true. I believe he was a rotten person. You know, American Jewry, particularly New York Jewry, was verschickert. They were intoxicated with FDR. You ask a Jew in the 30s who's the leader, they'd respond in Yiddish, in the drei Welten. The word for world in Yiddish is Welt. The drei Welten, there's three worlds. Der Welt, jener Welt, the Rose Welt. This world, the world to come, and FDR. That's how verschickert they were. The second event was, I think I want to get, hold on. We have, this is what happens, you don't speak from notes. We have we have the Anschluss,
Check so. Sudetenland?
Kristallnacht, I know, I'm missing one in the middle.
Sudetenland? But Czechoslovakia, no?
That's all part of the Avion Conference, that was in 1939? I don't know. Okay, let's make it two events. All right, and then we have, what I wanted to discuss really was American Jewry. I'm sorry, the St. Louis, that's what I'm looking for. Well, there we go. In May of 1939, the St. Louis sailed from Germany. Obviously, these are the wealthiest German Jews, not that that's important. If they get this point, part of Kristallnacht, I'm sorry, I'm going from 1930 to 1938. Part of Kristallnacht was that the Jewish community was fined 1 billion Reichmarks, which brought German Jewry to grinding poverty. And then, how are we doing? The Avion Conference. Okay, the Avion Conference, there we go. Thank you. The Avion Conference. Here we have, the whole world is assembled. 33 countries, 12 NGOs, in Avion, the border of Lake Geneva, border of Switzerland and France, to try and bring a solution to the refugee crisis. Now, FDR, the ultimate, the consummate politician, there was pressure on Washington to do something humane for all these refugees after the Anschluss. And FDR wanted to make a big spritz and accomplish nothing. So he convenes this conference, and for the first 2 days, there's bickering between France and America, who would chair the conference because they knew it would be a fiasco. In the end, every country got up and announced what they're not going to do to help the Jews. Australia said, we don't have a Jewish problem, we don't intend to import one. New Zealand said something quite similar. Canada said, we can take Jewish farmers. There were as many Jewish farmers in Switzerland, in Austria, and in Germany as there were internet technicians in 1938. Argentina said, we've taken as many Jews as the United States, which was true. Every country had an excuse why they wouldn't take. Remarkably, one country offered to give haven to Jews.
Argentina.
Yeah. Correct, the Dominican Republic. They offered to take 10,000 Jews. In the end, they didn't. They did a lot better than anyone else. And when my book, Heroic Children, I'm going to speak about this in a moment, when this book came out, I had book launches in several places, including in the Wiesenthal Center. I have a beautiful picture of Sal Teichmann's Kollel Feb sitting there at that. Sal is one of my children in Heroic Children. It's a name everyone I think in Los Angeles is familiar with, so I would love to speak about it, which I always do, but you all know the story. In any event, there was a book launch on. You're not familiar?
We know him, but he can tell a little bit of your story.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'll be happy to do that. There was a book launch in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and a gentleman raised his hand. He's from the Dominican Republic. Why? Are you familiar with the reason why? So they say, basically because he wanted to widen up the population with these European people. But this gentleman said that the governor of the island married a black woman, and their daughter, who was a mulatto, it was just not tenable to send her to school in the Dominican Republic. So they sent her to school in France. And she suffered a lot of humiliation. And she told her father when things started heating up with World War II, there was only one girl who always stood in my defense. It was a Jewish girl. And we don't know her name, but thanks to her, thousands of Jews made it to the Dominican Republic and were spared. That's a really important take-home message from the Holocaust, that we're all ambassadors. We can do something significantly beneficial, and we'll never know how this will help out our people. And then the third event was Kristallnacht. Okay. I told you I don't want to talk about the ghettos, but I just want to relate you one story about resistance. Always thrown in the face, why didn't they fight back? Whoever says this means you know zilch show about the Holocaust. If you're in a labor battalion of 10 and one escapes, what happened to the other 9? Incorrect, that's not the right word. They weren't killed, they were murdered, that's the correct word. When you say killed, you belittle the crime. The Nazis never killed. You're driving your car, Khalila, you run someone over, you've killed them. The Nazis' murder was premeditated. To say that the Nazis killed or that Hamas killed is belittling the crime. It's always premeditated. Jews were subjected to what's called excremental assault. They suffered from horrible bacillary dysentery. They could not relieve themselves when they wished. And they held on to life when it was not worth living. Or what's called the logic of destruction. You're missing one button from your pajama. For this you'll be murdered. But you don't have a button or a needle or a thread to sew it back on. You have a louse on your body, and to put their arms under their hands, under their armpits, their handful of ice chewing them alive. You can't delouse yourself, but you violated orders. I could give more examples, that's not my agenda. But I want to tell a story, but resistance happened every single day. I had a teacher, a very saintly teacher, with David Hirschmeyer, and his mother, Reb Leah Meyer, Aleh Shalom. She was in a labor camp in Austria, and she was highly expecting. And she davened, she prayed every day that it shouldn't be a boy. For to be a boy, she had the problem of arranging a bris, arranging a circumcision. Now, I can assure you, most people in camps are not worried about this, but this and only this was on her mind. And the woman had such incredible faith. She took the slop that was fed to her, buried it into the ground, so in fact, if we were perhaps she'd manufacture, cook, produce something out of it, and serve it at the Sudas Mitzvah, at the meal of the bris. God played a little trick, and a baby boy was born. And then miracle of miracles. On the 8th day, a transport arrived in the camp, and on the transport was the male from her village in Hungary to circumcise her, and she was ecstatically happy. Said, must be you brought your mile messer, must be you brought your knife from Mila, but he had not. With those few meager possessions you're allowed to bring with you, how could you remember to bring this? But she was a very important rep, and her honor he looked, and sure enough, he had made an error, and he brought the knife for Mila. Formed the bris, she held her and said, Menashe, don't cry. I denied you a proper circumcision, but with God's help, I'll yet provide a proper bar mitzvah. And 13 years later, in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, Hasidic Williamsburg, the 1950s, there were drinks and schnapps that filled lakes and oceans and rivers, and schmaltzer and gefilte fish that could fill vats and tubs, and kishke and kugel that could fill auditoriums and plazas, and everyone's drinking and eating and merry. Menashe gets up to deliver his bar mitzvah drasha, and just then this elderly gentleman walks in from the back of the room, malodorous, honorific, verstunken, redolent, wrinkled, crinkled clothing, but eyes that are chipped from agate. He walks right up to the front of the room in good old Williamsburg style, begins to clink on the soda bottle. Menashe, hi, man, Menashe, trying to quiet down this intruder. Menashe, hi, man, Menashe, one gentleman. A little more enterprise, the other passed him a bottle of schnapps, but he can't be dissuasive. But Rabbi said, ladies and gentlemen, you think you're here to attend a bar mitzvah, you're mistaken. In fact, you're here to attend a bris. At this point, the hook is out, and they wish to hear the end of the service. But Rabbi said, ladies and gentlemen, 13 years ago, we were deep in hell, denied and deprived, beaten and tortured every day. It was your mother who reminded us who we are, and indeed who we should be. You think what you're eating now is tasty, I want you to know that little something your mother served at your Sudas Mitzvah is more geschmack and heavenly than paradise itself. If she can maintain that there, how much more so can we maintain this who we are? Life is hard, but that's the way that it's configured. So this story I just told you, I wrote the story I don't know, some 29, 30 years ago. 16 years ago, my son was married in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. For those of you from New York, you know that Williamsburg has become the wedding capital of New York. And I'm just about to walk my son down to the chuppah. The Chassidish yid that I never saw before in my life, with all the trappings, like a rekel, bulletproof stockings, a hat, largely a shayla of Ohel and Shabbos. Walks over to me, said to me 3 words in Yiddish, had I not held on to the rail, for sure, I would have fainted. He knew who I was. I had no idea who he was. He said, Ich bin Menashe. That's the baby that I wrote about. Then he walked out of my life. That's the resistance of this woman. She made a family of Talmid Chacham, of tzaddikim. And we forget this story, which has to be told. Now, just one thing, which I told you, pardon the repetition, Alan. Here's a story about Sal Teichman. Sal Teichman, also the greatest gentleman I ever met in my life. He wrote the book on what it means to be a gentleman, but it wasn't really his fault. He came from such important and chashuv forebears, the Teichman family from Munkach. And in the death march, he weighed, I think it was 52 pounds. At one point, his brother, much larger than he, was a very short man, could not go any further, and Sal Teichman carried him on his back. Kilometer after kilometer, day after day. And we wrote the story. He's my final child in the story of 9 children. I'm a Rebbe, a teeny Rebbe in Shivat HaKotel. It's very common for students in Shivat HaKotel to conscript into the Israeli army. At the end of basic training is Masa. Masa means you go on a 40-kilometer hike with a full pack in the heat of the day, and they're nervous. And the army regulates and modifies and regulates your hydration. They monitor very carefully. And he was nervous. He's a strapping, tall boy, but he was nervous. And then he wrote on the chat for all the boys that were in the army. But when I read the story of Sal Teichman, Shlomo Zalman Teichman, how he carries back, I know he's going to carry me also. And that story has become lore in Shivat HaKotel for all the boys in the army. Okay, I want to end with one quick story that I had a personal mission. I wanted to write a book about the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust is the most documented crime in the history of history. And there's really nothing you can write about that's not been written about dozens of times in many languages. And thanks to Rabbi Marvin Heyer and Rabbi Abe Cooper, they came up with the idea of me writing a book about the children who survived the Holocaust. And before it was too late, I traveled the world. Now, I know a little about the Holocaust. And as Sal Teichman told me many times, the mind plays tricks. You work so hard to forget what happened and block out that horror that in the 1980s, when it became chic to start telling stories about the Holocaust, the mind played tricks. And it's hard to remember accurately. People told me incredible stories, but I knew things didn't add up. Historicity wasn't correct, and I couldn't write their story. So we gathered 9 stories that are meticulously researched, and that's the book Heroic Children. And we worked on this book for a little over 13 years. And then we finally made a draconian deadline we have to finish. And we met the deadline. And we're about to go to press, and I forgot something very, very important. We didn't have a cover for the book. A cover of a book is a very important component. Whoever tells me they don't judge a book by its cover, I know they never tried to sell a book. So we're trying to come up with a cover, and I put my team on it. That means my kids. And they're going through all the archives, and they came up with this picture, which I assume you can see in the distance. It's, I think, a very dramatic picture that was shot on the day that Auschwitz was liberated. And the copyright holder of the picture is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. Now, to use a picture on a book cover, you need permission. So you have to fill out a form online, fill out an affidavit, and commit you're not going to make any changes. And I wrote, I'm going to make this change, and 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 this change. And the next day, I got the picture. However, the picture came low res. And they wrote me, I'll get it high resolution in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. I don't think I had 3 days. And you'll pardon me for being an Israeli, but I thought the solution to this problem is protection. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is a large bureaucracy. There's over 300 employees. And so I have a friend who lives in Baltimore. He's a very powerful Jew. They say that in his cell phone, he has the private phone number of every senator and congressman. And you know that Baltimore to Washington is like you guys like to say, the other side of town, you know? It's always the other side. It's fair. I know I call it 213 and 310, but one side to the other side. If it's still 213, I don't know. Okay, I dated myself. The other side of town. So I am sure that he'd have a good connection. And the son was learning yeshiva across the street. So I run to yeshiva and say, Aryeh, thinking this is a rhetorical question, is your father connected to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington? And he says, no. Shrek and a half. Disenchanted, crestfallen, melancholy. I'm walking over the threshold and he tells me, but my mother is on the board. I was going to wring his neck. His mother's a judge, Chaya Friedman. I send her an email and say, Chaya, I desperately need your help. I need this picture. I gave her the lot number and a call number. And the next day I had the picture high res. But as I told you earlier, my angle on the Holocaust is always to highlight the individual. That's the way I teach it. That's the way I write about it. And I wanted, this picture, as you see, is sepia. I wanted to colorize one picture, one of the children, to make it look the way he looked at that time. Now, this requires special permission. So again, I wrote Judge Friedman, I said, Chaya, I desperately need your help. I want to colorize one of the children. Can you get me permission? And she wrote me back, I'm in the middle of convening a murder trial, and I don't have time. So I really appealed to her, and I said, Chaya, this is killing me. And I appealed to her, and she wrote me back, yay, nay, nay. Means I've made the request. I cannot assure you they'll agree. I'm thinking to myself, come on. This is the Holocaust. It's apple pie. It's mom. They're not going to say no. And we had, I'll use the technical term, we had a press queue at the largest press in Israel, arguably the largest press in the Middle East, at 10 o'clock that night. Now, when you have a press queue, if you don't show up, you pay for it, even if you don't print. And then you have to get in queue all over again. And then you may have to wait another 4 weeks till you press, till you print. 3 hours before press queue, to be accurate, 2 hours and 48 minutes, I get an email from the head archivist, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Dear Rabbi Teller, we regret to inform you, you may not use this picture. If you wish to use it in its pristine state without any zooming, this is very highly zoomed, zooming, colorization, you may. But once you make the slightest change, you don't have our permission. And in particular, you want to highlight this boy, now an elderly man. He recently spoke out. He's very sensitive. And our legal department said unequivocally, you may not use this picture. Shrek and a half. The plates were burned. They're on the drums. In 2 hours and 13 minutes, I'm going to have 10,000 copies, 10,000 covers. But I'm not such a pushover, a bit of a fighter. I write her back, I say, please, tell me his name and his phone number. I'd like to speak with him. 1 hour and 26 minutes to press queue. She writes me back, we don't know his name, nor do we know where he lives. I said, but you just told me he's sensitive and he spoke out. 51 minutes to press queue. She sends me an online clipping of this picture, which was shot on the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, of the people in this picture, obviously now in the grips of old age, pointing to themselves as youngsters in the picture. It was apparent, I want to use the yeshivish term, it was mashma from that article, that clipping, that this fellow's name is Hirsch. It wasn't explicit, but by deduction, I assumed it was Hirsch. And Hirsch lives in Europe. Now, I don't know if Hirsch is his first name or his last name. It could be either. I now have 46 minutes to find Hirsch in Europe.
Sounds simple.
So Sherlock Teller was thinking, now look at the picture. The kid looks pretty good. I knew right away he couldn't be a Pole. A Pole could never look this good. He'd have to be Hungarian because Hungary was invaded in March 1944. To be in this shape, you'd have to be Hungarian. So I'm thinking to myself, where would a Hungarian survivor of Auschwitz live in Europe today? So I right away discounted England, Russia, Eurasia, and I only have 29 countries to go. We're now holding 27 minutes to press queue, and I concluded it would have to be either Belgium or Switzerland. And I remembered, I have a really good friend who lives in Switzerland, lives in Zurich, Moshe Luzer is his name, and he works for IBM. What a shidduch, right? So 21 minutes to press queue, I call Moshe Luzer. Moshe Luzer, I desperately need your help. I need you to find me Hirsch in Switzerland, a Holocaust survivor. He said, what's his last name? I said, I don't know. What's his first name? I'm not sure. He said, is he from? Is he a religious man? He said, I don't know. He said, Chanoch, what are you drinking? I'm not drinking anything. I had 19 minutes to find this guy Hirsch, and I'm convinced he's got to be in Switzerland. You know what? He's Hungarian. I'll bet you his name is Gavor or Tibor. Gavor Tibor is Hungarian for Mike or Steve. And I hear him clicking on the typewriter. He says on the keyboard, he says to me, Gavor Hirsch, 89-year-old engineer, here's his phone number.
Wow.
9 minutes to press you, I call him up, my Heuche Deutsch. He gives me permission, and I'm so excited. I send off an email to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I say, I have permission, I'm going to press. If you have any questions, here's his phone number. I wouldn't call him now, it's already 9 o'clock in Switzerland. He's an elderly gentleman. And I want you to know it would be harder for me to parallel park than to get this guy in the first phone number. But I took that as my omen that this book would make an impact. And Baruch Hashem, we have. Thank you very much to the Wiesenthal Center for giving me the idea. And thank you for these people who gave me their stories. Anyways, this book, my other books are right here on the table. I'm leaving to Israel tomorrow morning. I can't take them with me. As I said before, I think you'll find them enriching. I know I will. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, that's fine. Right.
Thank you, Rabbi Chanoch, for this fantastic presentation. And if he wants to ask any questions or buy the books, he'll be here for a bit of time. Whatever food is left, please enjoy. Thank you to the Tabaz once again. Have a wonderful evening.